After the Denver Broncos' convincing win in Sunday of Week 2 of the NFL preseason, there's one sleeper at the safety position who's making his case for the 53-man roster. We'll highlight Keidron Smith and some other players on our Stock Up, Stock Down report here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, longtime site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Want to say thanks once again to everybody who's an everydayer here in Broncos Country. Thanks for making us your first listen, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Here's what you can expect on today's episode of the show. Following the Broncos' Week 2 preseason win against the Green Bay Packers, it is time to analyze the stock report. We'll look at stock up. We'll look at stock down. And we'll even analyze going into the third and final week of the NFL preseason, which players can still earn a roster spot with one game remaining. You're going to get all that here on today's episode of the show, which is also brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Sayre, let's get into our stock report. Opening up the paper here this morning, what does the market tell us about this Broncos team from a stock up standpoint? Handful of players stood out in Week 2 of the preseason. We're not going to even talk about Bo Nix. We're really going to focus here on this specific episode just on players who may be starters or maybe in contention to start at certain positions or just rotational depth. Where are we starting?
Well, let's start with the guy you mentioned in the intro, right? Keidron Smith, the safety. I think that he's had a couple of good weeks now stacked together. And when you look at that safety position, of course, the loss of Justin Simmons early in the offseason, that hurt Broncos Country a little bit. But the surprising move then to cut Caden Stearns. I know a lot of people are out there saying, I'm not surprised by it. He couldn't stay on the field. Anybody that says they didn't think Caden was in the team's plans this year is either lying or they're trying to convince you they know everything, which is also a lie. But I'm just saying, I think that young safety depth, Cody, was a huge question mark to pretty much everybody in Broncos Country. Keidron Smith has answered the call, though, a little bit, hasn't he? I mean, I was looking him up last night after the game as well, because honestly, like when you add guys like that to the roster, the immediate things that come to mind is like, well, he's a camp body. He's somebody that they're bringing in just for maybe a look-see in the preseason or whatever. But this guy played at Kentucky, was really good there, 6'2", very athletic, and somebody that I think, you know, might have some chops here. And he looks like it in the preseason, not just at safety, but also on special teams.
Yeah, and look, that's where the Broncos want the depth guys to play. Like, hey, like, can you play defensive called upon? Sean Payton certainly has given a lot of indications that he has faith in the young depth, and he's liked what he's seen from the guys, and certainly the results of the last couple of weeks tend to show that. And he can play special teams, which I think, you know, Denver's going to try to stock up on there and get some young guys, get a lot of the depth guys there so that they can really continue to build a strong special teams unit. And I said it in yesterday's post-game report too, like Keidron Smith's ascension really in the last couple of weeks, in my opinion, Sayre, when we look at it, like we were talking so much about Devin Key and JL Skinner. Look, Devin Key has solidified himself, in my opinion, as the team's third safety behind Brandon Jones and obviously PJ Locke. And obviously if Jones' hamstring lingers, it'll be Devin Key who starts for the Broncos. But I think at this point, Keidron Smith is it's jumped ahead of JL Skinner, in my opinion, at least on the depth chart from what we've seen in terms of making plays, special teams coming up there. So for me, I think that's definitely something that's worth monitoring. Keidron Smith, a guy who I don't think when the roster, the training camp roster came out, I don't think any of us thought we'd be talking about Keidron Smith in a position like this. So that's a good sign about the Broncos' young players and their ascension in terms of development there. Speaking of development and ascension, really, I feel like we should talk about Tyler Badie. He's a player that I have here on the stock report as well. I mean, Sayre, when you look at the run game and you look at where the Broncos have been the first couple of preseason games, Tyler Badie has seemingly just anytime he touches the ball, something explosive happens. Some good play happens. I thought he had a terrific run. It could have been an angry run, so to speak. He ran through a lot of tackles, but it got called back due to a holding call on Alex Forsythe. And it's like, shoot, there's that. But not only is he running and looking explosive, he's also making plays on special teams. And so for me, it's like, can he make the 53-man roster? There's a possibility. But I think regardless, even if he doesn't, Denver's going to find a way to make him a priority practice squad player here. But I thought his stock has really been on the rise. I think he's had a very under-the-radar camp.
I think he has too, Cody, and I think an underrated kind of just presence while he's been in Denver, right? I mean, his first touch went for a touchdown. It seems like every other time he touches the ball, it goes for a touchdown. Because remember, he had the rushing touchdown against the Colts. Now he had the receiving touchdown against the Green Bay Packers, had the big run, like you mentioned, that was called back. He was back ready to return a kick as well. Well, the Broncos underrated, Cody. We were talking about this before the show. Broncos didn't get a chance to return any kicks against Green Bay. I mean, it's nice to win 27-2, but also in the preseason, like there's guys we want to see out there returning kicks with this new format. The Broncos didn't get any opportunities. Tyler Badie is somebody that they think maybe can do that because he was back there. I saw 36 back there ready to return. So I really hope that they maybe kind of find a way to keep him around because at this point, I don't know that he's going to sneak through waivers. I know every year you have guys that you're like, man, I don't know if he's going to make it through waivers. But teams out there right now, they need help at the running back position. And a lot of teams need help at running back. The Giants, the Cowboys, the Bengals come to mind. A lot of teams would probably be looking at that and saying, man, the ink's still even drying on his scouting report. Tyler Badie's a good player with explosive speed, pretty good vision as we've seen as a ball carrier. So I don't know. I mean, he might be one of those types of guys that he's shown enough to maybe warrant a 53-man roster spot.
And this isn't going to be a hot take, but I do feel like Badie looked more impressive than Audric Estime in yesterday's preseason game, which isn't a knock against Estime. It's just we saw Badie just do a little bit more and flash a little bit more, and Estime's still growing through the process. And granted, we'll be honest, we'll talk about them a little bit later on the show when the stock down report comes out. Wasn't very pleased with the Broncos' secondary or third offensive lines in Sunday's game. So we'll highlight that. A couple other players we'll talk about here. I want to talk about Dondrea Tillman. He had a tackle for a loss on one run play to the right side. He's had a couple of plays where he's got good pressure, and also he's making plays and tackles on special teams. Is he going to make the 53-man roster? More than likely not at this point. But I guarantee you he will be, and if another team doesn't pick him up, he'll be a priority practice squad player. He could end up being that maybe fifth guy if Denver carries a fifth. I mean, it's tough right now because there's Darrell Nchami, there's Thomas Incoom. I really liked what I saw from Dondrea Tillman in that game yesterday, and I know you have a defensive lineman on your list as well.
Yeah, I really liked it was the first real action we've gotten to see from Ioma Uwazurike. Liked what we saw from him, and I think he deserves some kudos. He really got that interior pressure. I can't remember who ended up getting the sack, Cody, or if it was just a quarterback hit or what it was, but he got really good interior pressure at one point that forced the quarterback to his left. And only playing 16 snaps, I think he jumped out a couple of times. So really good to see from Uwazurike, who I know I saw Mike Kliss put out a 53-man roster projection late last week. Uwazurike was on the, likely to make it list. And so I feel like the Broncos really like him a lot more than people may realize. And he may be their fourth, fifth guy, probably the fifth guy on the defensive line, other than we've been projecting Angelo Blackson most of the offseason. I feel like maybe that spot is Uwazurike's at this point.
Yeah, very much so. And it's tough, though, too, because, like, for Uwazurike, they had every opportunity when he got suspended to move on. They're like, hey, like, this is something that's beyond our control. They stuck by him. There's something they see about him that, they want to continue to see. And look, even if he doesn't play much here, or if he just contributes on special teams, I think they're going to keep him on the 53-man roster, but it's to the extent of like, okay, who are you going to be taking off of your roster at that position specifically? So there's a lot of conversations to be had as we go through our stock up, stock down here on today's aftermath of the Broncos' victory in week 2 of the NFL preseason. We'll go through our stock down report here, and we're going to really focus on the Broncos' depth at offensive line after Sunday's game, there were several positions where there was concerning performances. If, in fact, the Broncos have to rely on some of these young guys to step up in case the starter goes down, we'll highlight that and several other players here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. As you all know, FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. Well, we have something a little bit different for you because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's right. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of Sunday Ticket. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. The Broncos will close out the preseason this week as 3.5-point home favorites against the Arizona Cardinals. You can get in on the action there on the money line. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon.
A potential starting candidate at center is on the stock down list after the Denver Broncos went up against the Green Bay Packers and dominated overall, but still some players that we got to be critical of their performance, starting with Alex Forsyth, the center. We'll talk about his performance as well as a few other players whose stock might be down here after the win against Green Bay. But Broncos Country, thank you so much for making us, your boys, Cody and Sayre, part of your day, however you choose to do so, wherever you listen to podcasts, free and available on all platforms, as well as on YouTube. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube over there. And for your second listen today, you got to check out Locked On Fantasy Football. And those guys are going to get you prepared for the season to come here. Cody, let's talk about stock down from this game for the Denver Broncos. I think we can start with Alex Palczewski. As if you're not, by the way, if you're not subscribed on YouTube, you miss out on some pretty epic stuff that happens in Cody's background. Sometimes we get a thumbs up bubble, sometimes a thumbs down, sometimes there's fireworks. We just saw lasers.
I have no idea
Cody.
what is happening. I don't know. I don't know how that happens. I'll have to look that up. But I have a Mac. I don't have my normal camera. So that's a little weird. There's fireworks here on the show, but unfortunately, we're not going to be talking about fireworks here when we talk about these stock down players.
Right. No, absolutely. I guess it's kind of like a dud, if you want to call it that, and unfortunately we do have to be, I know we like to be positive on the show and we get accused sometimes, Cody, of being too positive. So here's our dose of being critical and being objective, right? I guess for those people who say we never do it. Alex Forsyth, the center, he was supposed to be in the starting competition with Luke Wattenberg. I feel like the Broncos kind of knew at the beginning of training camp that it was probably leaning pretty heavily towards Wattenberg's favor, but Forsyth kind of cemented that in this second preseason game against Green Bay.
Yeah, it wasn't the best performance in terms of like you wanted to see if like, hey, is there, a question going into week one? Like, okay, is it close between these two guys? Luke Wattenberg has had the steady, consistent reps with the first team offense. And look, granted, Forsyth started out with Denver's first team offense playing guard. Hasn't played guard in a while. I'm not going to use that as an excuse there. But then when he did play center, you have the two holding calls. Like that right there is just something you want to brush up on. And look, Denver had a lot of penalties. We're going to do a stock down. It's the penalties too, because Denver had over 100 yards of penalties. I think it was 10 or 12 penalties that they had in the game. Not good. You want to clean that up. That's not something that Sean Payton's going to be very happy about. But Forsyth, just not ready yet. And that's okay, right? Because let's talk about it. Last year, he was a rookie, didn't play a single down in the NFL, redshirt year for him. Think about Luke Wattenberg's story, though. Luke, unfortunately, got thrown into the fire way too early as a rookie by Nathaniel Hackett. Hackett himself even came out and said that. And then last year, we saw him maybe rotate in at guard when Quinn Miners had that health scare in Los Angeles, but he didn't play much as in his second year. So just continue to develop here. I think that Denver likes Alex Forsyth. He's a high IQ football player. Maybe he can get a little stronger in certain areas. That's something that he can continue to develop on, and he'll be a backup this year for the Broncos at center. And so I'm not necessarily worried about that. I think the times I've seen him in a center, the snap always gets to the quarterback. That's the number one thing, right? The other things you can work on and adjust. So while it's stock down for him, there's still room for him to grow, and it's not necessarily the worst thing that he's not named the starter for the Broncos here at the center position, more than likely as we talk about it. I feel like maybe another player we could talk about, Samaje Perine, has kind of been on a little bit of the steady decline here. He didn't get a primary share with the first team offense. Really, it was Javonte Williams. It was Jaleel McLaughlin, the 1-2 punch that you and I have said, like, in our opinion, dating way back, you and I both believe those two guys are locked for the roster. Samaje's kind of, I think, trending downward to where now it kind of seems like all signs appear that he will be either released or traded before the roster cut down even happens.
Yeah, and the Broncos can save $3 million by trading or cutting him. So I think that's super helpful when you're talking about the salary cap and having alternatives at the running back position, right? And Samaje did great work last year in terms of being that receiving back 2-minute drill at the end of the first half, at the end of game situations. Like, he was money in some of those situations. So I mean, the Broncos got to be careful because you need to make sure, like, Javonte's got to be able to do that stuff. Jaleel's got to be able to do that stuff. But it does look like Samaje is definitely down on the depth chart for sure. And we know, I think Audric Estime is going anywhere. Like, the Broncos like him a lot. And we're talking about maybe Tyler Badie sneaking up there and potentially forcing the issue of a fourth running back. So to me, Samaje is for sure going to be getting cut or traded. And I think we'll see that in the next week or two here, or week or so here, because over a week from now, the Broncos pretty much have to solidify the roster. So, I mean, you could see a number of teams, like I mentioned earlier, a team like the Cowboys. You don't think they would love to have Samaje Perine on the roster and catching passes from, they got Rico Dowdle over there right now. I think Royce Freeman, a former Bronco, is competing for a spot. So, like, the grass is always greener, but I think Samaje could be better in a situation like that, honestly. So I say stock down for Samaje as well, Cody. I know we talked a little bit about Forsyth and the offensive line. We also talked segment 1 about Dondrea Tillman off the edge. I wonder if Thomas Incoom's stock is down a little bit. It sounded like he had a really good camp. I didn't see really anything from him. I know we need to go back and watch the All-22, which hasn't released as of the time we're recording this, but I didn't really see much from Thomas in this game against the Packers, which could have been pivotal for his roster chances.
Yeah, I don't recall seeing anything necessarily at the top of my head from watching yesterday's game in the press box with Incoom necessarily making a place. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I kind of have him really on the stock down here because of the roster gymnastics and maybe there being another position, right? Like, we talked about Keidron Smith earlier. Could Keidron Smith and how he has played, and with the uncertainty of, like, okay, Brandon Jones hamstring injury, that's something that is going to be worth monitoring here. Because of that, does this maybe force Denver to keep 5 safeties versus 5 outside linebackers? I think now maybe because of the top 4, you keep 4 outside linebackers. You still bring back guys like Darrell and Chami, Thomas Incoom to the practice squad, and then you just elevate them on game days. That's where my head is thinking right now in terms of stock down. It's not necessarily because of what Thomas Incoom did or didn't do. You're right. He's had a tremendous training camp. So he had a good preseason week 1. We'll go back and watch the All-22, but just stock down because it's like another position right now. It's kind of like my whole level of thinking here when it comes to Incoom. That, I think, is where Denver has to ask themselves, do you want to carry 5 outside linebackers? When you look at the defense, you very well, probably Denver's going to keep 6, maybe 7 corners, depending on special teams. Keidron Smith, really the big question mark there. I've got Denver keeping 6, not including Keidron Smith, but then I have them keeping 5 safeties because Keidron Smith's a guy who's made some plays here in the preseason. I guarantee you there will be a team who maybe needs some good safety depth, maybe not as starter, that might snag up Keidron Smith because of his play. Green Bay might even do it, to be honest with you. So we'll see how things kind of formulate there. But I will say that, you have to monitor this from all sides defensively, personnel, roster building. It's tough. But Incoom could be a guy that's back on the practice squad because of the emergence of a player at another position. That's just the roster gymnastics way of playing it here. But that'll really kind of highlight our stock down. And look, Broncos, could we maybe even throw in there too? We talked about Alex Forsyth. I just think the Broncos' second and third team offensive line in general, Alex Palczewski had a couple of penalties. I still like him as one of the tackles that Denver's going to keep on the 53. Thought DeMontre Jacobs did a great job. Everybody else from that standpoint, I didn't come away impressed with Sam Mustipher. Will Sherman had a really bad missed block that led to the Broncos shutout ending. Poor Zach Wilson got absolutely destroyed on that play. Frank Crum continues to struggle. Like, Denver's back end depth on the offensive line not a great look. They kind of get a little bit of a stock down from me. Your quick thoughts on that before we get into some other things here?
Yeah, 100%. He didn't get a real clean evaluation on Zach Wilson last night because of that. He didn't really have time out there to get any balls off. And I think it's affecting the wide receiver evaluation as well, which I know we're going to kind of talk about coming up next with a guy like Jalen Virgil. But like you're not getting a clean evaluation on these guys because there's pressure coming in at the quarterback. So it's tough to gauge maybe some of these bottom of the roster competitions that are going on at running back, wide receiver, and even quarterback because of the way those offensive linemen struggled in this game.
Yeah, and so it's definitely something you're going to have to like, hey, is there a level of confidence? How does this change how the Broncos build the 53 with the offensive line depth as is? Could they look elsewhere? I think there's a great chance Denver is going to look elsewhere for some other teams and some roster cuts to determine what they decide to do there. But makes things interesting, Sarah's roster cuts approach us here in just a week's time, and we'll have all the breakdown here on Locked On Broncos. But there is 1 week of the preseason left, and while training camp is over Broncos country, there are still several players who can earn a spot on the final roster inside the last preseason game against the Arizona Cardinals. We'll highlight players like Jalen Virgil and more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll focus a little bit on players who we believe can still earn a spot on the 53-man roster as the final week of preseason play approaches. Thanks once again to all the everydayers and those who make us your first listen. We appreciate you so much here. Sayre, we dive a little bit deeper here. We anticipate and hope that the Broncos will more likely make an announcement here soon on the status of Bo Nix as their starting quarterback for this upcoming season. But there are some players here on the roster who have a really great opportunity to go out there and maybe solidify their roster status here, maybe on the 53 or make an argument for it. Jalen Virgil is one guy that comes to mind. I mean, you mentioned the return aspect, and obviously in Sunday's game, we didn't get to see a lot of that. It was a little interesting that to open up the second half, we didn't see Jalen Virgil back there returning the kick return. I think it was Blake Watson and Tyler Badie. So are the Broncos at this point saying, hey, we know what Virgil can do. We're not going to put him out there because we think he's going to return a big kick. We didn't see him play as much. And I think when you look at something like that, it's like, are they trying to hide him? That's the vibe I got when it came to Jalen Virgil in Sunday's game.
I agree. I think a lot of Broncos country would agree as well, Cody, because when I threw it out there before the game, like, hey, who's going to seal up a roster spot tonight? A lot of fans are jumping into my mentions and saying, Jalen Virgil. I think everybody understands he's got the talent. He's got big time speed, playmaking ability. You and I talked about this. If you average catching the kickoff return somewhere around the 5-yard line, he can set you up at the 35 pretty much consistently, pretty much every time, averaging 30 yards a return. He's a dynamic player. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Broncos were kind of trying to hide him after seeing him do that in the first preseason game. Like he had the one explosive return as well. So I mean, it would be tough. It would be tough to get to the end of this preseason to see Jalen get cut from the team and know that, I mean, Marvin Mims hadn't been getting any reps in this new kickoff return format, which I think is very interesting to me because, yeah, he can probably do it. They're probably seeing it in practice, but in a game setting, we don't want to see him do it even just one time. And yet you're still playing him deep into like the third quarter of these preseason. I don't get what's going on there either. But yeah, Jalen Virgil to me, he could seal up a roster spot, whether it's the Broncos or another team. If he just takes one more kickoff return for 40, 50 yards, he's going to solidify a roster spot somewhere.
Now, the question I have too is we continue to look at players who can do that, make a roster spot name for themselves. Part of me is also wondering when we're looking at the rest of this team, like the secondary, you look at the safety position. We talked about Keidron Smith earlier as the sleeper, but Keidron's probably going to start or play this game this upcoming week against the Cardinals. Does this maybe give him the best chance to solidify like, hey, 2 weeks in a row, I've played well. I've done a lot on special teams. I've had 2 interceptions defensively. Can he go out here and say, okay, hey, it is a done deal. 3 straight games, you go out there and you stand out. Look, I'm not saying he has to come out and have an interception in week 3. If he does, great. That's fantastic. But I think you can come out here and say, okay, hey, he can go and he can make plays. He can lock up his roster status so to speak, here this week. How are you feeling about that? And is there any other players you feel like can maybe earn that final roster spot here going into this week?
Yeah, I think absolutely he can do that this coming week and force the Broncos to maybe change the way they're constructing the roster, because Sean Payton said last week, right? 44 guys roughly. I mean, in terms of solidified roster spots, leaving 9 potential spots open. So if there's 9 spots open, that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of roster competition that's going on. And Keidron could change the way they maybe if he plays well enough on special teams, it changes the conversation at corner or linebacker, right? I mean, these all have a domino effect on one another. One spot that I'm really interested to see, and I know you and I are planning a roster prediction for tomorrow's episode. I can't wait to find out what they want to do on the defensive line, because that unit looked really good against Green Bay. And it was the first and second units that I think to me really stood out, Cody, as the Green Bay Packers tried so hard for this to be an Emmanuel Wilson revenge game. They were force feeding him the ball from the very start of the game, and the Broncos defensive line just shut it down all game long. Jordan Jackson has been pretty impressive this preseason, and I from the sounds of it, sound like he had an okay camp, or at least a solid camp, good enough to be in the starting lineup for last week's game against the Colts. I like Jordan Jackson's chances right now, Cody. If the Broncos keep 6 defensive linemen, I think maybe he and Ioma Uwazurike, those guys could solidify roster spots against the Cardinals this coming weekend as well.
It's tough to figure out the numbers game with defensive line. I think Jordan Jackson's done a really good job. I also think Angelo Blackson, the Jackson and Blackson connection, has done a really good job defensively here for Denver. And especially like behind guys like John Franklin Myers and Zach Allen and DJ Jones, I think you really need solidified depth. Whereas I look at Inyoma Uwazurike, look, there's Malcolm Roach here on this roster as well. He could be that third guy that rotates in behind Malcolm Roach this upcoming season, behind DJ Jones. And you look at defensive end guys, I think you need, Angelo Blackson. I think you need Jordan Jackson as those DN guys. Those guys have all kind of stood out. And I think if they come out this week, I think you'll see Blackson play. I think you will see Jackson play. I think probably those guys will start. And I think you'll see I don't think you'll see Malcolm Roach start, but maybe Inyoma Uwazurike starts here. Maybe it is those 3 guys that I just named there as the starters on the defensive line. Maybe that helps us get a better idea. Now, I do think as we obviously close out today's show here, look, stock reports, stock up, stock down, players who can earn a roster spot. I know you teased a little bit that we'll be doing our 53-man roster prediction show tomorrow. We're obviously going to do that. I also think we'll probably do a segment tomorrow saying, okay, who are the Sean Payton's 44? And who are the players that are really in line for those final 9 spots? That'll be a fun thing, I think, for us to do in Broncos country. You want to get involved ahead of the action? Make sure you let us know if you're listening or watching Lockdown Broncos, wherever you get your podcasts, or available on the YouTube. We appreciate you so much for rocking with this. And obviously, it is Bo Nix watch this week. So the moment that the Broncos come out and name him starter, as we anticipate, we believe it's going to happen this week, we will have a breaking news episode. We'll react to it, and we'll talk about our expectations for him. You get all that here, and you can anticipate that on Lockdown Broncos. We'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show.